All right, so today we're going deep on something really cool. How indie games, those games made by often smaller teams or even individuals, how they make stories that are so unique and, really stick with you.
It's kind of a puzzle, right? They often don't have the giant budgets of those big AAA games, but the stories they tell, sometimes they hit even harder. We've got some really interesting perspectives to dig into about what makes them so special.
Yeah, exactly. And whether you're someone who's, sketching out game ideas of your own, or you just love indie games, or maybe you're just curious about how stories work in games, this deep dive is definitely for you. We're going to break down how those memorable indie game stories happen, what makes them tick, what's the secret sauce.
Yeah, and right away, it's important to think about how indie games, they've really shown everyone how important good stories are in games in general.
Totally.
Yeah.
You know, it's amazing when you think about just how much more money those big mainstream titles have. And yet, so often these indie games come along and they deliver these experiences that just stay with you. Like Undertale or Inside. Those games show you don't need, crazy graphics or huge open worlds to tell a story that really matters.
Right, and it seems like a big part of it is this like total dedication to, just pure creativity and trying new things. You see in indie development,
Yeah.
and without big publishers looking over their shoulders and worrying about, making tons of money, there's this chance to really put the story first in ways you don't see as often.
Okay.
So the question is, why does that freedom seem to lead to such strong storytelling?
Okay, so let's get into that. Why? How do indie developers actually approach making these stories? Where do they find inspiration?
It seems like a lot of times the ideas come from really personal places, or sometimes places you wouldn't expect. Like take Toby Fox in Undertale. He obviously loved Earthbound. You can see that. But he mixed in his own sense of humor. And then there's this, surprising emotional depth to it. It wasn't just copying. It was like he was using his own experiences to make something new out of something familiar. And maybe that's why it feels so authentic and players connect with it.
That makes sense. It's like that personal passion can get around the same old formulas we sometimes see.
Exactly. And this is tied to how much creative freedom indie developers have. Without big publishers calling all the shots, they can explore different ways of telling stories and experiment more.
So it's not just about what kind of game they want to make, but like how they tell the story within that game.
Right? Exactly.
Yeah.
This freedom lets them try stuff with storytelling that bigger studios might think is too risky or too weird for, a really big audience.
Yeah.
We see things like stories that don't go in a straight line or games with lots of different endings depending on what the player does. It makes the whole thing feel more personal.
Yeah, that feeling that the story changes based on what you do is so cool.
For sure. Like think about Oxenfree. It's not just about picking dialogue options, but your choices actually change how the characters feel about each other and even how the story unfolds. And that makes you feel way more connected to the story because it feels like you're really in it, not just watching it.
Yeah.
What do you think about that idea of the player actually having power over the story?
It makes me think about how much you care about the story. I mean, when your choices make a difference, you're more invested in what happens to the characters, right? So our sources also talk about some important people and moments that have shaped indie game stories. Who are some of the big names that stand out?
Well, you definitely have to mention Jonathan Blow. His game Braid back in 2008 was a huge deal. It had this story that was like woven into the game's time travel mechanics. And the story wasn't just told to you, it was part of how you played the game. It showed everyone that games could have stories that were smart and emotional and artistic. It
Yeah.
was proof that indie games could be just as ambitious as any other kind of game.
Braid definitely changed the way people thought about what games could be. What about more recent examples?
Celeste by Maddie Thorson and Noel Berry is another good one. Talks about mental health in a really honest and sensitive way, which is really amazing considering it's also a challenging platformer. So many players connected with it because it dealt with these difficult personal things in a way that felt real. It wasn't just about beating the game. It was like you were also facing these inner struggles that a lot of people go through.
Yeah, and our sources also point to Journey coming out in 2012 as being a big deal. What was it about that game that made such a difference for indie storytelling?
Journey was like a totally new thing. It showed everyone how powerful simple storytelling could be. There was basically no dialogue, no one explaining the story to you, but the visuals and the music and the way you interact with other players, it all came together to create something really emotional, almost spiritual.
Mm.
It really made people rethink what a video game could be and opened the door for more indie games that were more abstract and artistic.
Mhm.
It showed you could create meaning and connection without even using words.
It really is amazing how much emotion a game can make you feel without any talking. It shows just how much potential there is for storytelling that isn't all about words. Okay, so like we always try to do here on the deep dive, let's dig up some interesting facts about indie game stories. What cool little tidbits did we find?
Well, one fact that shows just how dedicated some indie developers are is that Undertale, which is this huge game with all these characters and lore, it was basically all made by one guy, Toby Fox, who designed it, programmed it, and even composed all the music. It's pretty incredible to think about, one person doing all that.
Yeah. That's mind blowing. It's really inspiring to think that one person could make something so complete and so beloved. What other interesting things did we find out?
This one's kind of cool. So the game Papers, Please, where you're a border guard checking people's documents. Well, it was inspired by the creator Lucas Pope's own experiences going through airport security. It's a good example of how even something that seems boring in real life can become this really interesting and thought-provoking game. It's amazing how he turned, standing in line at the airport into this really powerful game.
That's indie creativity for you,
Really?
right? Okay, so for anyone out there who might want to make their own games, or maybe even just people who love a good story, what advice can we take away from all these indie successes?
Our sources actually have some really good tips. The most important thing is a strong concept. Start with an idea that really gets you excited, something based on your own unique experiences or your own point of view, or even those random moments of inspiration.
Yeah, that makes sense. That first spark of an idea is everything, right? What comes after that?
Character development, that's super important. Even if your game's story is kind of abstract or minimalistic, you got to have characters that players can connect with on an emotional level, even if they're not typical characters. They have to feel believable in the world of your game.
Right. You have to care about what happens to them.
And then there's player agency, like we talked about with Oxenfree. Giving players the power to affect the story through their choices makes them feel way more engaged and invested in what happens.
Giving the player a real role in the story.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And don't forget about getting feedback. Share early versions of your game or your story ideas with people you trust. Their thoughts can help you make your story better and spot things that could be improved.
Fresh eyes are so important. And here's a tip that sounds simple, but a lot of people forget. Keep it simple.
Totally.
Okay.
Just because a story is complicated doesn't mean it's good. A story that's focused and well told with clear themes can be way more powerful emotionally.
Those are some great tips. Our sources also had some more, outside the box suggestions for people who want to tell stories. What were those?
One was to actually team up with people who aren't usually involved in making games. You know, bringing in writers or artists or musicians who aren't stuck in the normal ways of doing things that can bring in totally new ideas and shake things up. What do you think could come out of collaborations like that?
I'm imagining, a musician could bring a whole different feeling of pace or emotion to a story, or a writer from a different genre could have really unique ideas about how to structure a story. What was the other out there suggestion?
It was to experiment with different mediums to make your story even stronger. Think beyond just text and visuals in the game. What about interactive sound design or art styles that contribute to the mood of the story, or even mixing in real-world elements to make it more immersive and memorable?
Yeah, that's really pushing the limits of what game storytelling can be. So as we wrap up our deep dive, what's the main message we can take away about indie game stories?
I think the big takeaway is that indie games show just how much potential there is for telling amazing stories in games.
Yeah.
They're so creative, they're willing to take risks,
Yeah.
and they often have these really personal visions. And that leads to stories that are not only fun to experience, but that really stay with you and make you think about what storytelling in games can be. It's proof that you don't need a huge budget to tell a powerful story. All you need is passion and creativity.
Absolutely. They really show what human imagination can do. So everyone listening, we've talked about some amazing indie games today. Undertale, Inside, Oxenfree, Braid, Celeste, Journey, and Papers, Please. If you haven't played them, I definitely recommend checking them out and seeing all this amazing storytelling for yourself.
And as you play them, maybe think about this. Could it be that the things indie developers don't have, big teams and tons of money, maybe those things actually force them to be more creative with their stories? Could it be that those limitations make them focus on what's really important in a story, maybe even more than those AAA games, with all their resources? It's something to think about long after this deep dive is over.
It really is. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive, and we'll see you next time.
See you then.